She is full of shit. She's been lying to you from the start. Don't tell me you didn't know. Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome back. Dace here, and yeah, we are going to continue chatting a little bit about Axiom Verge. So yesterday I did the review, sit down and chat style, and there were like some other things that I wanted to get into, which we're going to do today. So I have my trusty friend, the laptop, right here with my notes, and I'm just going to go over a few things. And then, yeah, it's not going to be super in depth, but it's kind of just like, yeah, we'll touch on a few points which will raise some curious questions, or it will just kind of like make room for discussion or pondering, like, oh, is what we see in the game and what we're told in the game actually the truth, or is there something more that we're not seeing here? Okay, so one thing before I will go over this timeline that I've jotted down, I'll mention that in the review I go over just like a very point form like of the story from the perspective of the player, and that's because as the player, it's kind of up to you how much you learn about the actual timeline that you're experiencing, or that you're a part of anyway. And so, like, if you do the bare minimum, for instance, you will have not so much information in terms of what happens. I'm just going to pull this a little closer. What happens in like the ancient past, and like what role or like how that translates to the events that you're a part of. Okay, so in that sense, there's another, we'll just call it the greater picture. There is a greater picture, and when, like, I've heard people say that they think this Axiom Verge's story is like not interesting, and it's just like very like basic and whatever, but like to me this is one of the coolest sci-fi like game stories that I've ever come across, in terms of like 2D platformer like style, like retro, like whatever. So yeah, that's my opinion. You are welcome to disagree with that, but it's in depth, and it leaves so much room for just all sorts of wicked speculation. So without further ado, let's get into this. So our timeline, let me sip this first. Oh man. So our timeline begins with the Sudrans on planet Sudra. Okay, so they are a very prosperous and technologically advanced civilization. And what happens is they eventually have something happen. We're not 100% sure what, but we know it's either some sort of war or some big catastrophe. And from this situation, they learn that, or they realize the danger associated with the level of advancement that their technology has. If it's, maybe it has something to do with it being misused, or who knows what, but essentially they have this experience, and they decide to just more or less lock away all of their technology, and it's taboo to use this stuff. So they enter a dark age, and they become extremely religious, and that is their focus, and yeah, their civilization essentially just collapses. So then we come to the next part, so 2005, so that's when Trace and Dr. Hammond are in New Mexico. They're doing their experiment in the lab, as I've said in the review, and the frozen pressure valve explodes, lab collapses. Trace is in the hospital for months. He's blind, crippled from the waist down, and he has a scientific epiphany, okay? So then we go to 2006. So Trace publishes his theories about this new way of thinking and approaching science and all that kind of stuff. He's rejected by the scientific community and given the name Athetos, which is interesting because had he, for those of you who've played or know the story well enough in the game, had he remembered this bit of information earlier on, like let's say he was aware of it when he first heard Alcinova use the name Athetos, he would have been like, oh, well, I've been called that too. He may have clued into things a lot quicker, but that was not the case. He didn't remember the scientific community giving him that name until much later. So he publishes his findings, blah, blah, blah. Trace and Dr. Hammond traverse the breach and arrive on Sudra. So that's the first time, okay? And this is ages before you ever pick up the game and start where the game starts, okay? This is ages before that. So they come across a rebirth chamber. So that's like with the save pod where you save your game. And they use this to fully heal Trace, okay? So when he shows up on Sudra, he's still in a wheelchair. And interestingly enough, there's this one section, I think it's in Erebu, or it's somewhere, but it's like really tucked away, and from what I recall, I don't think you can access it unless you have certain upgrades and like whatever else. So that being said, you can see this little wheelchair discarded in this like far off cave, like this little tiny corner. So I think that's a really sweet item that Tom Happ kind of just like hid away to hint at things. So Trace is fine. So yeah, together they begin exploring Sudra, and they start finding all of this super advanced technology locked away and stored, more or less. So Trace attempts going upstream to find answers on the next world, because he's like very curious as to like what is going on this planet, and like why, like he just wants to know what's up, more or less, because he's like in this amazing place. He sees this awesome technology, and yet it's not being used for anything whatsoever. It's literally just sitting around. So he's very curious. At this point, Hammond's fate is unclear to us. Like after this point, there's no more mention of him. So I don't recall if I mentioned this yesterday, because I did start this discussion video, but then there was like an issue with someone cutting grass outside, and it was so loud, and at one point it sounded like they were just like hovering out the window, even though we're on like the second floor. So I just scrapped that video entirely. So yeah, it could have been in the review, or it could have been in the one that I scrapped, but at this point we don't see Hammond anymore. But one thing I want to interject with quickly is that for a future game by Tom Happ, I think it would be absolutely incredible if he wrote some way for Dr. Hammond to make an appearance again, either as like, let's say, a nemesis of some sort, where you're just blown away at the end of the game by like, oh, holy smokes, Dr. Hammond, who just, we have no idea what happened to him way back on Sudra. He just is suddenly here. Or even something more simple, like he just makes a cameo as like, oh yeah, hey, I'm here, I'm still doing this. Like, it would just be really cool. And for those of us who are the diehard fans of Axiom Verge, like, I think we would just really appreciate that kind of thing. But anyway, at this point we have no idea what happens to Hammond, because yeah, there's just no other information. So at this point, Trace returns to Sudra and releases the pathogen killing thousands, or so we're told. And by that I mean, like, the trace Athetos, obviously, because the clone that you play as does not exist for quite some time. And I will get into... Okay, so I'm just scrolling down. So the Sudrins release the Rizalki and grant them access to all of the technology. So they more or less unlock the Rizalki and say, okay, here, take all this stuff, go after this guy for what he did. Now, interestingly enough, okay, actually, no, I'm going to hold off on that point because it's so good. So the Rizalki destroy the mobile pathogen protection unit that Athetos uses. So he retreats up into the elevator, like the very top of that one section. But before doing that, he shuts down the power filter and the repair drones, which is crippling the Rizalki. So this is where the standstill begins, and we're not too sure how many years pass where they're both kind of just not able to get at each other at this point. But the Rizalki are decaying. Athetos is literally just aging, or whatever he does, up at the top of the elevator, and nothing else is happening. So then we go to the year... the year 2200 to 2500, in and around that time, okay? So remember, the intro scene is happening in 2005, okay? When you start the game a few seconds later, it's already 200 to 500 years later, okay? So that's pretty amazing. So Alcinova and Ophelia create the clone, and you begin your adventure. So that's when you first start things. You go through the events of the game, of course. Your Trace, the one you're playing, defeats Athetos, and then Alcinova kills him, sends Trace back to Earth, just like that. Trace feels off about this and begins researching how to get back to Sudra, because he didn't really want to necessarily just be sent back without any say. That's exactly what happened. It was a very abrupt choice on Alcinova's part, to just be like, okay, Trace, I'm going to send you back now. Thanks so much. See ya. And that was that. Trace was like, wait, hold on. What's going on? But we just see him pass out, and we are led to believe that he did indeed go back to Earth. But the main stuff I want to get at is the question, did he really go back, or are we just being deceived? And we are going to explore that together after I sip this. Okay, so throughout the game, there are bits and pieces of data that can be collected, sometimes in the form of, I think, tablets or electronic messages, or even pages from a book, or even just notes, letters from one person to another, that you can find. There are a bunch of these, okay? And these are very important in terms of understanding and getting a feel for the greater picture, like I said at the start here. And if you're missing this stuff, you are missing vital points in terms of painting and filling in as many of the blanks as possible. I cannot stress that enough. It is just crucial if you want to really get at some truth here. And when you piece these things together, there are certainly things that have light shed on them, and at the same time, it also brings up other questions, or kind of casts a light of uncertainty on things that you were told to be true, or things you just assumed were the case, okay? So one thing which I'm going to get into now is the secret ending, which is going to further amplify that uncertainty. So at the end of the game, of course, you beat it, you see Trace saying like, oh, Earth doesn't feel like something's just off, and then the credits roll. At the very end of the credits, you'll see this little image. There's like some sort of platform, and then like these Rizalki tendrils or tentacles or whatever, and you see Trace passed out at the base of these. Maybe it's some sort of holding room, or maybe it's just like an actual Rizalki, and Trace is just passed out at like just below her or like under her, I mean. But that's very, very strange if you think about what we've witnessed or what we've been told, and that is that like Trace goes back to Earth. It's like, okay, if he's on Earth, why are we seeing him passed out at the foot of a Rizalki being? It's just very curious. Now, if you score a high enough percentage for both the map and the item collection, you will unlock a secret scene beyond that point, which I've shared in one of my videos, actually. And it goes to the scene where Trace, it's like nighttime or something, he's in the lab, all the lights are off except the glow of his computer screen, and he's typing away, and he's saying something like, oh, I've almost figured it out, and then he hears a noise at the door, and he turns around, and it zooms in or whatever on Athetos, okay? So someone we've seen killed by Elsinova. Athetos is there, he's in a trench coat, he has a mask thing on, and I think I'm not sure if he has a hat, but he's like, yeah, dressed, and he says like hello or like something like that. But anyway, the point is, he pulls out a gun and says something to the effect of like, oh, you can't run from yourself, and then he shoots Trace. Now, at first, you might be thinking like, whoa, what the hell? Like, Athetos died, but then somehow he's here on Earth, and he's going to, like, he just kills Trace when he was like about to find out how to get back to Sudra. Like, is it like maybe a clone of Athetos, or like what is going on here? And you might think that like, oh, okay, maybe Trace is actually dead, but when you look into it a little deeper and you take all of the information from the notes and you do a little of your own brain work, you'll quickly realize that something else is going on here, and that's what I'm going to share. So okay, yeah, I think the way I will approach getting into that is asking this question. Could the Rizalki have been the ones who released the pathogen on the Sudrans and not Athetos? And the reason I bring that up is because if you were collecting the notes and things and being thorough, you will have come across information, like there's one letter, for instance, called Oraka. If you remember the long chamber, that's literally just like a transit way, and you ride that giant head, that's actually another Rizalki by the name of Oraka. Her mind has been shattered from countless years of confinement by the Sudrans when they were all locked away. So she, at this point, is just brain dead, more or less, or she's in, maybe not brain dead, but she's in some sort of state where like she can still traverse the halls, but she's done, like she's dead. And so there's a letter that I just mentioned, Oraka, and you can kind of sense like that the Rizalki are not the happiest about this confinement that they were subjected to by the Sudran people. Because like these are sentient entities, like sure they may have been created, they're certainly like artificial intelligences of some sort. But that doesn't make them any less interested in like being out and about and doing their own things. So years of this, like there's definitely some bitterness there, okay? Um, so, 1 second here. Okay, so just to elaborate on this and where I'm going with all of it, throughout the game, Trace is lied to by the Rizalki. Even Trace senses this and learns this at different points. But just based on the way the Rizalki talk to him, like you never really, or at least I didn't ever really trust them, even though you're teaming up with these entities. I actually trust Athetos more than the Rizalki because, well, for one, we don't have nearly as much direct contact with him, so we don't have him exchanging too much dialogue for him to even be lying to us about much of anything. But on top of that, his situation is like very different. And again, when you piece a lot of this stuff together, which I recommend reading, just go on like Axiom Verge fandom or whatever and just read all the details if you're interested, because this just gets so good. Anyway, we also know that they're willing, the Rizalki are willing to kill Trace. They do it once, and we know that he can be subdued. So there's the one time where he's like, oh, well, no, I'm not going to do like what you want. Or he says something like, oh, well, how are you going to stop me if I don't want to go along with this? And Elsinova causes him to pass out, or that might actually be the time where she kills him. And then one of the other ones like brings him back in a rebirth chamber. That demonstrates that like if the Rizalki aren't getting their way, they will discard you, or they will lash out. Like they will operate from their emotions as opposed to reason to some degree. So like we have these moments where there's blatant information expressing to us that, okay, like maybe these aren't such pals that we're helping out. Maybe they have an agenda of their own. And if we don't do what they want, they're just going to screw with us. Just give me 1 second, please. Okay, another interesting thing, and I have no idea whether this is going to seem like it's all wrapped up by the end, but yeah, whatever, I'm enjoying it, and we're getting there anyway. So when you're doing the fight with Athetos, he says something along the lines of like, oh, if I tell you too much, your captors will kill you. And I won't speak for anyone else, but for me, when I hear this, I'm just like, captors? Like, what captors? Like, is Trace, like, when has Trace been a captive other than like what I just mentioned? And that's my point, is like, Athetos is hinting at something here, and Trace, the one you play as, doesn't know nearly as much as he could know. And this ties into what I was bringing up about maybe the Rizalki released the pathogen, because like, man, like, yeah, it's so crazy. Like, we don't have any actual proof that Athetos was the one to do it. There are certainly motives for both, okay? Like we're told that Athetos did it for this reason, blah, blah, blah. But there's something else going on here. Here, this is another point I want to bring up. If you recall, Trace contracts the pathogen at one point in the game. Now, interestingly enough, if you've gone through the game, you'll notice that Athetos isn't able to cure himself of the pathogen that he has, okay? So, yet he created it, so that's really strange. You would think that or at least I think that if someone like Athetos created the pathogen himself, he would be able to cure it. And interestingly enough, the Rizalki, I think it's Ophelia, like when Trace has it, she cures him like that. And it's just like, okay, if the, and this ties into maybe what I said about the Rizalki possibly being the ones to have released the pathogen, because if Ophelia is the one to just magically heal Trace in an instant, then like, why didn't they help the Sudrans out when the thousands were dying from the pathogen? Sure, they may have learned about it later, but I personally doubt that. So I'm thinking like, okay, if you know this pathogen in and out, that just to me says that like, oh, okay, maybe it wasn't actually Athetos. Maybe there's more that you guys aren't confessing here. It's just an interesting point. Okay, so that more or less brings me to the end of my notes. The rest is kind of going to be like just me chatting about whatever. But yeah, so more or less to kind of organize or like bring focus and clarity to like all of these things that I've kind of jumped back and forth to, I will say that there's just something very fishy about this ending and about how things are resolved, which they are not resolved whatsoever. We are left with a very open-ended ending, and I love it actually because it just leaves so much room for speculation and just brainstorming and just racking, your mind for like what Tom Happ may have planned or what it is like that he has in mind for what the ending means. So another thing I'm going to get into now that we have all that other stuff out of the way, is throughout the game, there is not a single instance in which we see Elsa Nova doing anything in the way of transporting Trace from one world to another, okay? So the way he gets to Sudra, as far as we're told initially, is that I think Ophelia is the one that can like do that stuff, or that's what we're told anyway. Which, yeah, is a lie, because yeah, we know that like the original Trace, we know that he got to Sudra by discovering this new way of working with science and the forces of nature, or like whatever technology he was working on. But when we start the game, we're told that the Trace that we play as was brought to Sudra by, I'm pretty sure it's Ophelia. I could be mistaken, but anyway, they're claiming that they brought Trace, but we know that is not the case, and he was just like a clone made from the leftover DNA of the original one from like hundreds and hundreds of years, like who knows, maybe even thousands. Actually, no, the timeline's stated. Yeah, well, yeah, it is actually. Yeah, never mind, it is thousands. So, yeah, like there's a prime example of how like we are lied to by the Rizalki. Okay, what was I just going on about? God. Anyway, I may even just edit that out if it doesn't come back to mind, because I got off on a tangent there. And okay. Okay, so as I was saying, so there's no shred of evidence that Elsa Nova has any sort of capability to do transporting of like one person from one place to another, and yet at the very end of the game, she's saying, oh, I'm gonna send you back to Earth, like, well, like everything's been taken care of, don't worry about it, and then boom, you're gone. Interestingly enough, we've seen that she can subdue Trace like that when she gets pissed off, or like whenever she wants to, for that matter. But again, there's no way that we've seen that she can do this. So what I believe is that what she really did is she just put Trace into a coma and lied to him about going back to Earth. So that would explain why at the end of the credits we see him just passed out there, because like she doesn't have the capability, even if she says she does. She's full of shit. Like I said at the very start of this video. So what I'm thinking is that the secret scene where Athetos comes and shoots Trace, that was kind of like Trace's mind. He's in this state. He's like passed out. He's experiencing this. If you recall Ophelia, or yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Ophelia. Again, some of the details are a little sketchy because I've put this off for days and days, but one of them we have heard can create like dream worlds or like dream algorithms. So I honestly think that it was their plan to just convince Trace that he's experiencing his life back on Earth, when in reality he is literally just laying on a floor somewhere, rotting away slowly because he's in a coma. And they're kind of just like keeping tabs on him and just letting him decay and fade away, because we know Ophelia can create that state for him. We know that there really isn't any way for them to transport him back to Earth to a different time. Like, that's just complete rubbish. So what I'm thinking is that when we see the scene of Athetos killing Trace, that's Trace's mind realizing that, okay, something's up in this dream world, Earth, that I believe to be the real thing, but I know something's off, and I'm starting to squirm and to figure things out. And so his mind creates this image of Athetos showing up, shooting him, so that Trace will awaken from this state that he's been put into. And I honestly believe that that is like the most true course. Like I legitimately believe that is like what happens, or that is what is happening. Like it is the most logical. It's the most, like, it has the most info going for it, in my opinion. Even though it's still, like I said, open-ended, I feel like it's just a very solid bet in terms of thinking like, okay, like what is happening here? Without question, I think that's how it's going. So yeah, anyway, that really sets things up for an awesome sequel when Tom Happ gets to that in 4 or 5 years. Because like, if you think about it, Trace is still on Sudra. He's passed out somewhere. That is like a golden opportunity for such a kick-ass start to a game. Like, he could be like waking up in some chamber by himself and being like, wow, I remember being here who knows how long ago, when, like, before I was put into the coma. And then he begins exploring. He maybe hears like a Rizalki flying around somewhere off in the distance and realizes that, like, oh man, like, this is not a situation that I want to be like careless in. But yeah, anyway, from there you can see where a story would go and how awesome that could be, just picking up from where we left off, sort of, but like after the fact as well. Anyway, that's gonna wrap this up. Like I said, there is so much more reading that you could do on this, and I literally bounced all over the place, and my approach was kind of just like sit and talk casually without getting too in depth or too focused on every minuscule detail. So in that sense, it may have seemed kind of like whatever. But anyway, I enjoyed chatting about some of this stuff, and I trust it at least raised enough curiosity or wonder about what is really going on in this story. And yeah, so if you do your own research, feel free to, or even if you don't, feel free to share your comments below, your own personal speculation. I think that would be great to hear, so we can get into some discussions about that. Anyway, yeah, be sure to like, subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching, and yeah, definitely let me know what you think, because like I just love this game. It is incredible, and I love these story. And like I've been saying the whole time, like when you piece all this information together, and even so much more than I got into here, and you look at it like all in front of you in an organized way, just things start to click and piece together, and it is just a fantastic experience. So yeah, you guys have an awesome day. Thank you so much again, and yeah, I will see you next time.